October 22nd, 2023. A construction crew breaks ground behind an abandoned rail yard in Mapleton, Illinois. What they uncover in the shallow grave will expose a 34-year conspiracy that reaches into the heart of law enforcement itself. But this story doesn't begin with bones in the dirt. It begins with a silver heart necklace and a girl who never made it home. The arrest of 78-year-old Richard Lang shocked a community that had trusted him for decades. But the real shock was learning they'd condemned an innocent man for over 3 decades while the killer walked among them wearing a badge. October 22nd, 1989. Mapleton, Illinois. 5:47 p.m. Rebecca Hargrove touches the silver heart pendant at her throat, watching her reflection in the bedroom mirror framed by autumn light. The necklace catches the afternoon sun filtering through her mother's lace curtains, casting tiny rainbows across the wall covered with veterinary school brochures and acceptance letters from Southern Illinois University. At 17, Becky carries herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly where life is heading. Her acceptance letter to the pre-veterinary program sits pinned above her desk, surrounded by photographs of neighborhood cats and dogs she's helped nurse back to health. By this time next year, she'll be living in a dormitory, studying anatomy and pharmacology, working toward the dream she's held since childhood. Tonight, she's scheduled for the dinner shift at Mel's Diner, saving every dollar for textbooks and lab fees. Downstairs, the kitchen holds the comfortable warmth of an evening routine unchanged for 17 years. Linda Hargrove moves between stove and counter with practiced efficiency, packing her daughter's dinner into the worn brown bag Becky has carried to work for 6 months. Turkey sandwich with mustard, apple slices wrapped in wax paper, and a thermos of hot chocolate sweetened with vanilla. The scent of cinnamon fills the air from the apple pie cooling on the windowsill, Becky's favorite, made from a recipe Linda learned from her own mother. Steam rises from the golden crust, and she makes a mental note to save Becky a slice for when she returns from her shift. "Mom, have you seen my name tag?" Becky's voice carries down the narrow staircase. "Kitchen counter, next to your tips from yesterday." Becky appears in the doorway, buttoning her white uniform blouse. The diner requires its waitresses to look professional, and Becky takes pride in the crisp appearance that earns her better tips than most of the other girls. She's calculated that 3 more months of steady shifts will give her enough savings for her first semester's books. Outside, October wind rattles the windows, carrying the first real cold of the season. The maple trees in their front yard stand nearly bare, their leaves scattered across the sidewalk in patterns that will be gone by morning. In the distance, the paper mill's whistle announces the shift change. 5:50 p.m. exactly, same as every weekday for the past 40 years. Linda hands her daughter the brown bag, their fingers touching briefly in the exchange. "Mrs. Patterson called about her cat again," Linda says. "She thinks Whiskers might have an ear infection." Becky smiles. "I'll stop by tomorrow before work. Probably just needs a good cleaning." These words, casual, ordinary, full of plans for tomorrow, would replay in Linda's memory for the next 34 years. Becky kisses her mother's cheek, a quick gesture made automatic by years of routine, and heads toward the front door. Her footsteps cross the wooden porch, creak down the 3 steps to the sidewalk, and fade into the evening air. Linda continues cleaning the kitchen, humming while she works, unaware that she will never hear those footsteps again. The emergency dispatch recording begins at 10:47 p.m., crackling with static and the barely controlled panic of a mother who knows something is wrong. 911. "What's your emergency?" "My daughter didn't come home from work." Becky Hargrove. She's 17, and she's never been late before. Not once. Her shift ended at 9, and she always calls if there's any delay. Always. The dispatcher's voice remains calm, professional. "What's your daughter's full name and address?" "Rebecca Linda Hargrove. We live at 412 Elm Street. She works at Mel's Diner on Main. The bus route takes exactly 12 minutes. She should have been home by 9:30 at the latest." Linda's voice carries the particular tremor of someone trying to convince herself that reasonable explanations exist while knowing in her heart that something terrible has happened. "Has your daughter ever stayed out late without permission?" "No, never. Becky is responsible. She's saving for college, working extra shifts. She wouldn't just disappear." The call continues for 4 more minutes, with Linda providing physical descriptions, work schedules, and the growing certainty that her daughter is not coming home tonight. Present day, Illinois State Police Cold Case Division. Detective Rachel Owens opens the evidence box marked Hargrove, Rebecca, closed case hashtag 1989-0847 for the first time in her 15-year career. The cardboard has yellowed with age, held together by evidence tape that crackles when she breaks the seal. Inside, crime scene photographs from 1989 show images that seem both dated and timeless. Police cars with older light bars, investigators in suits that haven't been fashionable for decades, and crime scene tape that looks identical to what she uses today. But it's the personal effects that catch her attention. A silver heart necklace, carefully preserved in a clear evidence bag. A single white sneaker, size 7, with laces still tied in a double knot. A diner name tag reading Rebecca. Owens has worked enough cold cases to recognize the signs of an investigation that closed too quickly with too many loose ends. The evidence inventory lists items that were never properly tested, witness statements that seem incomplete, and forensic reports with conclusions that don't quite match the available evidence. October 22, 1989, 11:15 p.m. Police Sergeant Mike Torres pulls his patrol car into the Hargrove driveway, his headlights sweeping across a front yard where Halloween decorations hang from trees like warnings. The house shows every light burning, creating rectangles of yellow warmth against the October darkness. Torres has been a cop for 12 years, long enough to distinguish between teenage rebellion and genuine emergency. Linda Hargrove's voice on the dispatch call carried the unmistakable tone of a mother who knows her child's habits better than anyone else in the world. He finds Linda pacing the front porch, still wearing her work clothes from the bank, where she processes loans and listens to other people's financial dreams. Her graying hair is pulled back in a bun that's coming loose, and her hands shake slightly as she approaches his car. "Officer, thank you for coming so quickly." Torres removes his notebook, though he already knows most of what he needs to ask. "Tell me about Becky's routine. What time did she leave for work?" 6 o'clock. She catches the 6:10 bus from the corner of Elm and 3rd. Her shift starts at 6:30. And she was supposed to be home when? 9:30. Her shift ends at 9, and the return bus gets to our corner at 9:28. She walks the 2 blocks home. I timed it myself when she first started working there. Torres makes notes, though he's already thinking about search protocols and missing person procedures. Something in Linda's certainty convinces him that this isn't a case of teenage independence. "I'm going to call this in officially and start a preliminary search of her route," he tells Linda. "But I want you to stay here in case she comes home or calls." As Torres drives away from the Hargrove house, he radios the situation to dispatch and requests backup units to check the bus route and the area around Mel's Diner. The streets of Mapleton, familiar as his own neighborhood, suddenly feel different in the darkness, full of shadows and possibilities he doesn't want to consider. The search begins immediately, though no one realizes they're looking for evidence of murder rather than signs of a missing teenager. 3 patrol cars converge on the bus route between Mel's Diner and Elm Street, their spotlights cutting through October darkness that seems thicker than usual. By dawn, they find her shoe. Officer Janet Mills spots the white sneaker beside the railroad tracks, half hidden beneath leaves that the wind has scattered during the night. The shoe sits upright, as if Becky had simply stepped out of it, laces still tied in the careful double knot that Linda taught her when she was 6 years old. But it's what Sergeant Torres discovers 20 feet away that transforms a missing person case into something far more serious. 2 sets of footprints in the soft mud beside the tracks, one small, consistent with Becky's size 7 shoes, and another much larger, with deep impressions that suggest someone heavy, someone strong. The larger prints lead toward the railroad crossing and then back again. The smaller prints only go in one direction. Becky Hargrove had no idea that walking to work that evening would change her town forever. Have you ever had a feeling something terrible was about to happen? Share your experiences in the comments below, because this case proves that sometimes our worst fears come true in ways we never imagine. Torres crouches beside the footprints, his radio crackling with updates from other search teams. But his attention focuses on the story written in mud and leaves. evidence of an encounter that ended with one person walking away and another disappearing forever. As the morning sun rises over Mapleton, Illinois, Torres understands that this quiet town is about to learn that evil can wear familiar faces and trusted uniforms. 2 sets of footprints went to those railroad tracks, but only one came back. Somewhere in Mapleton, a killer was already planning how to make an innocent man pay for his crime. If you want to see justice served after 34 years of lies, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because this case will make you question everyone you think you trust. The first 48 hours in a missing person case are critical. In Becky Hargrove's case, those 48 hours would create a web of false leads that would misdirect the investigation for over 3 decades. The real killer was watching every move the police made, and he was helping them make all the wrong ones. October 23, 1989 dawn. The search mobilizes before sunrise with the efficiency of a military operation. Volunteer firefighters arrive from Madison, St. Clair, and Bond counties, their orange safety vests creating bright spots of color against the gray morning sky. The Mapleton High School parking lot transforms into a command center, with folding tables displaying maps marked in red grease pencil and radio equipment crackling with constant updates. State Trooper Richard Lang stands at the center of it all, coordinating search patterns with the calm authority that has made him Mapleton's most trusted law enforcement officer. At 34, Lang carries himself with the bearing of someone who has never encountered a problem he couldn't solve through methodical investigation and genuine dedication to his community. The Bloodhounds arrive at 6:15 a.m., led by handlers from the State Police K-9 unit. The German Shepherds pick up Becky's scent immediately from clothing Linda provided, a sweater that still holds the faint fragrance of her daughter's perfume. The dogs follow the trail from the bus stop on Main Street toward the railroad crossing with purposeful intensity. Then something happens that puzzles even experienced handlers. At the crossing, the dogs begin circling frantically, whining and pawing at the gravel between the tracks. They sit down in apparent confusion, unable to continue the trail despite clear evidence that they've been following the correct scent. It's like she just vanished, handler Margaret Stone tells Lang, her voice troubled. I've never seen the dogs react this way. Usually, if someone gets into a vehicle, we can at least track to where the trail ends. But here, she gestures helplessly at her confused animals. Lang makes careful notes in his distinctive handwriting, documenting the dog's behavior and the exact location where they lost the scent. To observers, he appears completely focused on finding Becky. No one notices his subtle satisfaction when the trail goes cold. The Hargrove house becomes a gathering point for the community's collective anxiety. Linda sits at her kitchen table, mechanically preparing coffee for the volunteers who stream through her home, offering help and prayers. The turkey sandwich she'd packed for Becky's dinner still sits on the counter where she left it, the bread beginning to curl at the edges, becoming a monument to interrupted normalcy. Neighbors arrive throughout the morning carrying casseroles, homemade cookies, and the awkward comfort of people who don't know what to say but need to do something. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down organizes the food donations. Jim Morrison, the mailman who's known Becky since she was small enough to run to the mailbox in her pajamas, coordinates with his postal service colleagues to distribute missing person flyers. Linda moves through these activities in a state of controlled numbness, functioning on the mother's instinct that staying busy might somehow bring her daughter home. But her eyes constantly drift to the kitchen window that faces the direction Becky would return from work, and her hands shake when she thinks no one is watching. Lang arrives at the Hargrove house during the afternoon, his uniform crisp despite hours spent coordinating search efforts. He finds Linda standing at her kitchen sink, staring out at the backyard where a rope swing still hangs from the old oak tree. Mrs. Hargrove, Lang says gently, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder with practiced compassion. We'll find her. I give you my word on that. Linda turns to him with eyes that hold a mixture of gratitude and desperate hope. She's such a good girl, Trooper Lang. She doesn't take risks or make poor choices. If she's not home, it's because someone prevented her from coming home. I understand, Lang replies, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has solved difficult cases before. We're going to leave no stone unturned. Every lead will be followed, every possibility investigated. The search expands as October rain begins falling, creating a gray wash that turns the landscape monochrome. Teams of volunteers move through Miller's woods in methodical lines, their orange vests bright against trees already stripped bare by early frost. The paper mill's smokestacks release white steam that mixes with low-hanging clouds, creating an atmosphere heavy with moisture and uncertainty. Calls flood the police station from residents reporting possible sightings. A girl matching Becky's description was seen at the bus station in Belleville. Another witness claims to have noticed someone walking along Highway 15 around midnight. Each lead requires investigation, pulling resources away from the primary search area, while hope and frustration build in equal measure. By afternoon, investigators focus their attention on the people closest to Becky's daily routine. The initial suspect emerges quickly and with compelling circumstantial evidence. Dean Mercer works as a mechanic at Patterson's garage and picks up evening shifts washing dishes at Mel's Diner to supplement his income. Several witnesses place him near the bus stop around the time Becky disappeared. More concerning, multiple co-workers confirm that Mercer had been asking Becky out persistently over the past month, and she had consistently declined his invitations. Dean was sweet on her, confirms Janet Mills, Mel's evening manager. But Becky wasn't interested. She was focused on college, on saving money. She was polite about turning him down, but Dean didn't seem to understand that no meant no. Lang brings Mercer in for questioning at 4:30 p.m. The interview room at the Mapleton police station is deliberately intimidating, small, windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent fixtures that cast unflattering shadows and make everyone look guilty of something. A single metal table sits in the center, scarred by years of nervous fingers and aggressive questioning. Mercer enters the room already defensive, his mechanic's coveralls replaced by a nervous energy that manifests in chain smoking and constant movement. His hands shake as he lights each cigarette, and his eyes dart between Lang and the door as if calculating escape routes. "I want to be clear about something right up front," Mercer begins, his voice higher than normal. "I liked Becky. She was nice to me when other people treated me like dirt, but I never would have hurt her. Never." Lang studies Mercer with the professional detachment that has served him well throughout his career. He notes the mechanic's obvious anxiety, his defensive posture, and his inability to maintain eye contact. But something about Mercer's nervousness feels wrong, more like fear than guilt, more like confusion than deception. "Tell me about your relationship with Becky," Lang says, his tone neutral but probing. "We didn't have a relationship," Mercer replies quickly. "I asked her out a few times. Maybe more than a few times. But she always said no, and I respected that. I mean, I understood. She's going to college, and I'm just a mechanic." "Did that make you angry? Being rejected?" Mercer's cigarette trembles between his fingers. "No. Disappointed, maybe. But angry? No. Becky was. She was like an angel, you know? Pure and good. I wouldn't hurt someone like that." Lang continues the interview for 90 minutes, probing Mercer's alibi and his activities on the evening of October 22nd. The mechanic claims he went straight home after his shift at Patterson's garage, around 6 p.m., and spent the evening watching television alone in his trailer. "Can anyone verify that?" Lang asks. "No. I live alone. But I didn't hurt Becky. I swear on my mother's grave, I didn't touch that girl." The evidence against Mercer remains circumstantial but compelling. He had opportunity. He was in the area when Becky disappeared. He had motive, unrequited romantic interest that could have turned ugly, and he had no alibi for the critical hours when the crime occurred. But Lang recognizes that nervous doesn't necessarily mean guilty, and Mercer's reactions seem more consistent with a man afraid of being falsely accused than someone trying to hide his guilt. Present day, Illinois State Police Cold Case Division. Detective Owens reviews the original Mercer interview tapes with the benefit of 34 years hindsight and modern investigative techniques. The audio quality is poor, the cassette tapes have degraded over time, but digital enhancement brings out details that weren't apparent in 1989. Something in Lang's voice catches her attention during the interview. When Mercer struggles to account for his whereabouts after 7 p.m., there's a subtle note of satisfaction in Lang's questioning, as if he's pleased by the suspect's inability to provide an alibi. It's a small detail, easily missed, but suggestive of an investigator who's more interested in building a case than discovering truth. Owens makes a note in her file. Lang's interview technique. Review for bias? October 24, 1989. The search continues into its second day with growing urgency. 48 hours have passed since Becky was last seen, and experienced investigators know that the chances of finding her alive decrease with each passing hour. The breakthrough comes at 2:15 p.m. when volunteer searcher Tom Bradley spots something metallic caught on a bramble bush near the railroad tracks. Becky's silver heart necklace hangs from the thorny branches like a small beacon, its chain broken as if torn away during a violent struggle. Lang processes the scene personally, photographing the necklace from multiple angles and carefully documenting its position relative to the tracks and the nearby maintenance buildings. The jewelry is bagged as evidence and transported to the state crime lab for analysis. But the results prove disappointing. Despite being torn from Becky's neck during what must have been a violent encounter, the necklace clasp yields no fingerprints. The metal surface has been cleaned, either by weather or by someone who understood the importance of removing trace evidence. Whoever did this knew enough to clean up after himself, Lang reports to the investigation team. We're dealing with someone who understands police procedures. Dean Mercer was about to become the prime suspect in a case that would destroy his life. But was he guilty, or was someone else using him as the perfect scapegoat? What do you think? Does nervousness mean guilt? Let me know in the comments. On the morning of October 25th, the third day of searching, everything changes. A team of volunteers searching the area behind the old railroad maintenance shed makes a discovery that transforms a missing person case into a homicide investigation. Becky's body lies in a shallow grave, hastily dug but carefully concealed behind the abandoned building that once housed equipment for maintaining the rail lines. But the location raises immediate questions. The maintenance shed sits in an area accessible only through overgrown paths known primarily to railroad workers and local law enforcement who patrol the industrial district. The question that will haunt the investigation for the next 34 years. How did Dean Mercer know where to find a hiding place that even longtime Mapleton residents would have trouble locating? The discovery of Becky Hargrove's body should have brought closure to Mapleton. Instead, it opened a Pandora's box of evidence that pointed in directions no one wanted to look. The investigation was about to take a turn that would haunt the town for decades. October 25, 1989 dawn. The crime scene behind the maintenance shed transforms from abandoned lot to sterile investigation zone within hours. Cook County Medical Examiner Dr. Sarah Chun arrives as morning mist still clings to the railroad tracks, her team unloading equipment that will document every detail of what they find in the shallow grave. Yellow crime scene tape flutters in the October breeze, creating a barrier between the investigators and the growing crowd of onlookers who gather despite the early hour. News travels fast in small towns, and word that Becky Hargrove has been found spreads through Mapleton like wildfire. Dr. Chin works with methodical precision, photographing the grave site from multiple angles before beginning the careful excavation. The burial is approximately 4 feet deep, hastily dug but thoughtfully concealed beneath layers of leaves and branches that suggest someone familiar with covering evidence. Becky's body shows signs of blunt force trauma to the head, a single devastating blow that likely caused immediate death. Her diner uniform remains intact, ruling out sexual assault as a motive. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment confirms what investigators already suspect. Becky has been dead for exactly 3 days, establishing a timeline that matches her disappearance. State Trooper Richard Lang stands at the crime scene perimeter, his jacket pulled tight against the morning chill that carries the scent of decay and disturbed earth. He moves between stations with professional efficiency, photographing evidence, interviewing the teenage boys who discovered the body while looking for a place to smoke cigarettes, coordinating with county detectives who have jurisdiction over homicide investigations. To everyone watching, Lang appears completely dedicated to finding justice for Becky. He takes detailed notes, asks pointed questions, and demonstrates the kind of thorough investigation that has earned him respect throughout his career. But there's something in his posture, a tension around his shoulders, a way he holds himself that suggests personal stakes beyond professional duty. When Dr. Chen points out specific details about the burial site, Lang's responses are perhaps too knowledgeable, too quick, as if he's already considered these possibilities. The evidence builds against Dean Mercer with the inexorable weight of an avalanche. By noon, a witness comes forward claiming she saw Mercer's distinctive pickup truck, a rusted blue Ford with primer spots on the hood, parked near the railroad crossing on the night of Becky's disappearance. Margaret Foster, who works the night shift at the paper mill, tells investigators she noticed the truck because it was parked in an unusual location, blocking part of the service road she uses to get to work. I remember thinking it was strange, Foster explains to Trooper Lang, who takes her statement personally. That road doesn't go anywhere except to the old maintenance buildings. Nobody parks there unless they're up to something. Another witness reports hearing raised voices coming from the direction of the tracks around 8 p.m., angry, urgent conversation that stopped abruptly. The testimony places Mercer in the area during the time frame when Becky was killed. But the most damaging evidence emerges during a search of Mercer's trailer. Hidden in his toolbox, wrapped in an oil-stained rag, investigators find Becky's silver bracelet, a delicate piece of jewelry that Linda Hargrove confirms her daughter was wearing when she left for work. The bracelet shows signs of violent removal, its clasp bent and partially broken. The rag contains stains that appear to be blood, though forensic testing in 1989 lacks the sophistication to determine whose blood or how it got there. Lang processes this evidence with the same methodical care he brings to every aspect of the investigation. He photographs the bracelet in position before its removal, documents the condition of Mercer's toolbox, and ensures proper chain of custody procedures that will make the evidence admissible in court. Mercer's arrest takes place at his workplace, Patterson's garage, where he's trying to maintain normal routines despite the investigation swirling around him. State police arrive during the afternoon rush, creating a spectacle that draws neighbors and co-workers to watch as justice appears to be served. The mechanic's face shows confusion and terror as handcuffs lock around his wrists. His voice breaks as he shouts denials that echo off the garage's concrete walls. "I never touched that girl. I swear to God, someone's setting me up." The words sound desperate, almost rehearsed, and they do nothing to convince the growing crowd that gathers to watch his perp walk. To Mapleton residents, Mercer looks exactly like what they expect a killer to look like: nervous, defensive, and unable to provide convincing explanations for the evidence against him. The town's reaction is swift and merciless. Amy Peterson, Mercer's fiancée of 2 years, breaks off their engagement within hours of his arrest. She appears at the police station that evening to retrieve her engagement ring and make a statement distancing herself from the man she thought she knew. "Dean never told me he was interested in that girl," Amy tells reporters who have descended on Mapleton like locusts drawn to tragedy. "If I'd known he was bothering her, I would have ended things sooner." Patterson's garage fires Mercer immediately, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. His family's phone rings constantly with anonymous callers leaving death threats and demands for vigilante justice. The Mercer family name, carried by hard-working people for 3 generations in Mapleton, becomes synonymous with evil. Present-day, Illinois State Police Cold Case Division. Detective Owens reviews the 1989 evidence inventory with the perspective that only time and technological advancement can provide. The blood on the rag wrapped around Becky's bracelet was never properly tested. DNA analysis wasn't available to small-town police departments in 1989, and budgetary constraints meant that evidence was often stored rather than sent to state labs for expensive testing. But the evidence remains in storage, carefully preserved in climate-controlled conditions that maintain its viability for modern forensic techniques. Chain of custody documentation shows no tampering or unauthorized access over the past 34 years. Owens makes notes about which items should be prioritized for DNA testing, focusing on evidence that might yield genetic profiles of multiple individuals. If someone other than Mercer handled Becky's bracelet, modern science might finally provide the proof that was impossible to obtain in 1989. The case against Mercer builds with methodical precision throughout the autumn of 1989. Prosecutor James Walsh, an ambitious attorney eyeing higher office, announces his intention to seek the death penalty. The brutal nature of the crime and its impact on the community demand the ultimate punishment, he tells reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. Becky Hargrove was an innocent young woman with her whole life ahead of her, Walsh declares, his words calculated for maximum emotional impact. Dean Mercer stole that future, and justice demands that he pay the ultimate price. Mercer's court-appointed attorney, Robert Shun, finds himself overwhelmed by the complexity of defending a capital murder case with limited resources and public opinion running strongly against his client. The evidence seems overwhelming, the community demands conviction, and Shun privately advises Mercer to consider a plea bargain that would spare his life in exchange for a confession. But forensic science in 1989 operates within significant limitations that create opportunities for evidence manipulation by someone with inside knowledge. Fingerprint analysis proves inconclusive. The surfaces where prints might be found have been cleaned or degraded by weather. Blood evidence is minimal and difficult to type using available technology. Most of the prosecution's case relies on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, both vulnerable to influence by someone with access to the investigation and knowledge of what testimony would be most damaging. The central question that haunts everyone involved in the case remains unanswered. How did Dean Mercer know to bury Becky behind the maintenance shed? The location sits hidden behind overgrown vegetation, accessible only through paths known primarily to railroad workers and local law enforcement who patrol the industrial area. When defense attorney Chun presses this point, Mercer's response only deepens the mystery. "I've never been back there in my life," Mercer insists during one of their preparation sessions. "I don't even know that place exists. I work on cars, not trains. Why would I know about some old railroad building?" The question lingers without satisfactory answer. Either Mercer is lying about his familiarity with the area, or someone else chose the burial location and found a way to implicate him in the crime. The evidence against Dean Mercer seemed overwhelming, but sometimes the most obvious suspect isn't the guilty one. Have you ever been wrongly accused of something? How did it feel when no one believed you? Share your stories below, because this case proves that the truth isn't always what it appears to be. 3 weeks before Mercer's trial is scheduled to begin, the investigation takes an unexpected turn. Gary Latham, a retired railroad worker who spent 40 years maintaining the tracks and equipment around Mapleton, contacts the police with information that could change everything about the case. Latham tells Sergeant Torres that he has information about the night Becky died, information that makes Torres question everything they think they know about the murder. But before Latham can provide his full statement, he receives a phone call at his home that makes him suddenly reluctant to cooperate with the investigation. The voice on the phone is calm, professional, and terrifyingly specific about what could happen to witnesses who remember things incorrectly. Gary Latham had worked the railroad for 37 years. He'd seen accidents, fights, and petty crimes around the tracks. But what he witnessed on October 22, 1989, was something that would haunt him until his death and beyond. His testimony could have saved an innocent man, but fear kept him silent for decades. November 15, 1989. The same interview room that had held Dean Mercer 3 weeks earlier now contains a different kind of tension. Gary Latham sits across from Detective Torres, his weathered hands trembling as he lights his third cigarette in 20 minutes. At 58, Latham carries himself with the stooped shoulders of a man who has spent 4 decades working outdoors, his face mapped with lines carved by sun, wind, and the weight of keeping dangerous secrets. His eyes dart constantly toward the door, as if expecting someone to burst through and silence him before he can speak. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows that emphasize every crease and worry line, making him appear older than his years. "I should have come forward sooner," Latham begins, his voice roughened by decades of smoking and shouting over the noise of freight trains. "But I was scared. Still am, if I'm being honest." Torres activates the cassette recorder, its mechanical clicking unnaturally loud in the small room. Outside, November wind rattles the windows of the police station with a sound like dried bones, and somewhere in the building, a radiator clanks irregularly. "Tell me what you saw, Gary." Latham takes a deep drag from his cigarette, using the pause to gather courage for words that will change everything about the Becky Hargrove investigation. When he speaks, his testimony unfolds like a revelation that exposes the fundamental wrongness of everything they believe about the case. I was working late that night, Latham explains, ash falling onto the metal table between them. October 22nd. Had to finish repairs on switching mechanism number 7 before the morning freight came through. It's tedious work, but it pays over time, and my wife was after me to fix the roof before winter. Torres makes notes, establishing the timeline and Latham's reason for being in the rail yard after normal hours. Around 8:30, maybe 8:45, I heard voices coming from behind the old maintenance shed. Voices and then shouting. At first, I thought it was kids fooling around back there. Happens sometimes, teenagers looking for places to drink beer or smoke cigarettes. Latham pauses, his cigarette burning down toward his fingers without him noticing. But then I heard the girl scream. Real terror in that voice. Detective. The kind of sound that makes your blood freeze. So I went to look. What Latham witnessed from his hiding spot behind a pile of railroad ties would have exonerated Dean Mercer immediately, if anyone with authority had known to ask the right questions. I saw 2 men back there, Latham continues, his voice growing steadier as he commits to telling the truth. One was wearing a diner uniform, dark hair, maybe mid-20s. Slight build, maybe 5'8". But the other man. He trails off, cigarette trembling between his fingers. The other was wearing a state police jacket. Official badge, uniform pants, the whole setup. And they were fighting over something, or someone. Torres feels the ground shifting beneath everything he thought he knew about the case. Did you recognize either man? The one in the diner uniform, I'd never seen before in my life. Didn't look familiar at all. But the cop. Latham's voice drops to barely above a whisper. I've seen him around town for years. Young trooper, always professional when you meet him on the street. Polite, you know. But that night, he was different. Angry in a way that scared me. The implications hit Torres like a physical blow to the chest. If Latham is telling the truth, a state trooper was involved in Becky Hargrove's murder. And that same trooper has been leading the investigation, building the case against Dean Mercer with access to evidence and witness statements. Gary, this is very important, Torres says, his voice carefully controlled. Are you certain about what you saw? About the police uniform? As certain as I am of my own name. The jacket had the state police patches, the badge, everything official. And the way he carried himself, that was a cop. No question. Latham describes watching the confrontation escalate until the man in the police jacket struck the other person with something heavy. The scream that followed was cut short, and then there was silence except for the sound of digging. I stayed hidden for maybe 2 hours, Latham admits, shame evident in his voice. Too scared to move, too scared to help. When I finally got the nerve to look again, both men were gone. I went home and tried to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But pretending became impossible when Dean Mercer was arrested and charged with Becky's murder. Present day, Illinois State Police Cold Case Division. Detective Owens discovers Latham's recorded statement buried in a mislabeled evidence box that contains materials from several different cases. The cassette tape is degraded, 34 years old, and stored in less than ideal conditions, but digital enhancement makes the conversation audible. More troubling than the tape's condition is the complete absence of any record that this interview took place. Latham's statement never appears in the official case file, was never reported to prosecutors, and shows no evidence of follow-up investigation. Someone buried this testimony deliberately. November 15, 1989, evening. After Latham leaves the police station, Torres sits alone in his office trying to process the implications of what he's heard. If a state trooper killed Becky Hargrove, then the entire investigation has been compromised from the beginning. Worse, that same trooper has been positioned to control the evidence, influence witnesses, and ensure that an innocent man takes the blame. But making such an accusation requires more than one witness's testimony, especially when that witness admits to hiding for weeks before coming forward. Torres drives to his usual thinking spot, a hill overlooking the railroad tracks where Becky's body was discovered. The maintenance shed sits in darkness below him, surrounded by overgrown weeds that rustle in the November wind like whispered secrets. The silver ribbon Linda Hargrove tied to the crossing gate flutters in the breeze, catching occasional light from passing cars. He tries to corroborate Latham's story, but every avenue leads to frustration. Other railroad workers claim they saw nothing unusual that night. Security logs from the state police barracks show all officers properly accounted for during their shifts. Most significantly, Trooper Richard Lang has an ironclad alibi for the time in question. Lang's duty log shows he responded to a domestic disturbance call at 8:15 p.m. on October 22nd, remaining at the scene until 9:30 p.m. The family involved, Jerry and Susan Walsh, confirm his presence throughout that period. The timeline makes it impossible for Lang to have been at the railroad tracks when Becky was murdered. But Torres begins noticing inconsistencies in the physical evidence that trouble him. The blood spatter patterns at the crime scene don't match the supposed murder weapon, a tire iron allegedly belonging to Mercer. The depth and angle of Becky's head wound suggests someone taller and stronger than the slight mechanic. Most puzzling, how did Becky's bracelet end up in Mercer's toolbox when crime scene photographs clearly show the same bracelet still on her wrist when her body was discovered? Either there were two identical bracelets, or someone planted evidence after the fact. The questions multiply without satisfactory answers, creating doubt where certainty should exist. Gary Latham's testimony should have changed everything about this case. But sometimes the truth is too dangerous for people to handle. Have you ever known something that could help someone but been afraid to speak up? What stopped you? Share your thoughts below, because silence can be its own kind of crime. 2 days after giving his statement, Gary Latham receives a phone call at his modest house on Railroad Avenue. The voice is calm, professional, and terrifyingly certain in its knowledge of what Latham has told police. Mr. Latham, this is concerning your recent conversation with Detective Torres, the caller says without identifying himself. I think you misunderstood what you saw that night behind the maintenance shed. Memory can be unreliable, especially for a man your age who was working in poor light conditions. Latham's hand tightens on the receiver. Who is this? Someone who wants to help you avoid embarrassing yourself by repeating stories that can't be proven. Stories that might cause trouble for your family, your pension, your standing in the community. The threat is subtle but unmistakable. Latham thinks of his wife's heart condition, his grandson who depends on him for college tuition, the small life they've built over decades of honest work. When Latham tries to contact Detective Torres the following morning, the desk sergeant delivers news that makes his blood run cold. Torres has been reassigned to another case. The Mercer investigation is now under state police jurisdiction, led by Trooper Richard Lang. The man Latham identified as Becky Hargrove's killer is now in complete control of the evidence that could prove his guilt. Dean Mercer's trial began on January 8, 1990, in a courtroom packed with Mapleton residents hungry for justice. What they witnessed over the next 3 weeks wasn't justice. It was a masterclass in manipulation orchestrated by the real killer. The truth sat buried beneath perjured testimony and planted evidence, waiting 34 years to surface. January 8, 1990, Madison County Courthouse. The courthouse buzzes with the electric anticipation that accompanies high-profile murder trials in small communities. Jury selection proceeds with unusual attention from local media, and every seat in the gallery fills with residents who knew Becky Hargrove personally or feel connected to her story through the shared trauma of living in a town where teenagers can disappear and die. Prosecutor James Walsh moves through the proceedings with the confidence of someone who sees this case as a stepping stone to higher office. At 38, he's built his reputation on aggressive prosecution of violent crimes, and the evidence against Dean Mercer appears overwhelming. Walsh has arranged the facts into a narrative so compelling that conviction seems inevitable. Defense attorney Robert Shunn, court-appointed and overwhelmed, struggles against circumstances that seem designed to ensure his failure. His client maintains innocence despite evidence that grows more damaging each day, and Shunn lacks the resources to conduct the kind of thorough investigation that might reveal alternative theories. The prosecution's case unfolds with methodical precision over the first week. Witness after witness places Mercer near the crime scene during the critical hours. Margaret Foster testifies about seeing his distinctive pickup truck parked near the railroad crossing. Other witnesses describe his persistent romantic interest in Becky and her consistent rejection of his advances. The discovery of Becky's silver bracelet in Mercer's toolbox becomes the centerpiece of Walsh's argument. Linda Hargrove identifies the jewelry through tears, confirming that her daughter was wearing it when she left for work that final evening. This bracelet was torn from Becky's wrist during her struggle for life, Walsh tells the jury, holding the evidence bag with theatrical gravity. The defendant kept it as a trophy, hidden among his tools like a dirty secret. Walsh's closing argument paints Mercer as a textbook case of rejected male entitlement turned violent. Becky Hargrove was 17 years old. He declares, Linda's quiet sobbing audible throughout the gallery. She had dreams of becoming a veterinarian, of dedicating her life to helping animals who couldn't help themselves. Instead, she became the victim of a man who couldn't accept the simple word no. But Chen's defense reveals cracks in the prosecution's seemingly solid narrative. During cross-examination, he highlights inconsistencies in witness testimony and the troubling absence of physical evidence directly linking Mercer to the murder scene. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen argues during his closing, the prosecution wants you to believe that Dean Mercer committed this terrible crime. But they cannot answer the most basic question. How did a mechanic who has never worked for the railroad know about a burial location that even longtime residents would have trouble finding? Chen points out that the maintenance shed sits hidden behind overgrown vegetation, accessible only through paths known primarily to railroad employees and law enforcement officers who patrol the industrial area. The prosecution's theory requires you to believe that Dean Mercer, in a moment of panic after committing murder, somehow knew exactly where to hide a body in the most concealed location in Mapleton. Does that make sense to you? Present-day, Illinois State Police Cold Case Division. Detective Owens reviews the trial transcripts with growing unease. Gary Latham's name appears nowhere in the court record despite his recorded statement to Detective Torres. The railroad worker who witnessed a state police officer at the crime scene might as well have never existed. More troubling are the sidebar conversations between attorneys and Judge Margaret Foster, discussions held outside the jury's hearing that reveal how much information was kept from the people deciding Mercer's fate. Owens finds references to inadmissible witness statements and unsubstantiated allegations that were never fully explored. The trial record suggests a deliberate effort to limit the scope of evidence presented to the jury. January 22, 1990. The trial's most dramatic moment comes when Detective Torres is called to testify about the investigation's thoroughness. Under direct examination, Torres describes the methodical search for evidence and the careful consideration of all possible suspects. But during Chen's cross-examination, Torres faces questions that force him to confront his own moral choices. Detective Torres, did any other witnesses come forward with information about the night Becky Hargrove was murdered? Chen asks. Torres hesitates, aware that his answer will either condemn an innocent man or destroy his own career. Other individuals provided statements, yes. What was the nature of those statements? Various accounts that we couldn't corroborate, Torres replies carefully. Chen presses harder. Did any of these witnesses claim to have seen someone other than Dean Mercer at the crime scene? Walsh objects before Torres can answer, and Judge Foster sustains the objection. The jury never learns that Gary Latham identified a state police officer as one of two men he saw behind the maintenance shed on the night Becky died. In the courtroom gallery, Trooper Richard Lang sits in full uniform, his presence a visible symbol of law enforcement's commitment to justice. Community members see his attendance as proof that police support the prosecution's case, reassurance that the right man is on trial. But to Torres, Lang's presence carries a different message, a reminder of who controls the investigation and what happens to those who ask inconvenient questions. The forensic evidence, limited by 1990 technology, fails to provide the definitive answers that might resolve lingering doubts. Blood typing is inconclusive. Fingerprint analysis yields no matches on critical pieces of evidence. The prosecution's case ultimately relies on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, both vulnerable to manipulation by someone with inside knowledge of the investigation. The jury deliberates for 18 hours, wrestling with evidence that feels overwhelming but somehow incomplete. January wind howls around the courthouse as they file back into their seats, their faces revealing nothing about the decision that will determine Dean Mercer's fate. Mercer sits motionless at the defense table, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights that make everyone look guilty of something. Linda Hargrove grips her husband's hand in the front row, her silver hair catching afternoon sunlight that streams through tall windows and creates patterns on the worn wooden floor. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Foster asks. We have, Your Honor. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupts in a chaos of emotion that has been building for months. Mercer's mother collapses in her seat, her quiet sobs mixing with Linda Hargrove's whispered, "Thank God." Outside, reporters surge toward the courthouse steps where Prosecutor Walsh declares justice served and promises that Becky's memory will be honored through this conviction. The sentencing phase proceeds with mechanical precision. Character witnesses describe Mercer as troubled but nonviolent, while prosecutors present victim impact statements that emphasize Becky's lost potential and her family's ongoing suffering. Judge Foster sentences Dean Mercer to life in prison without possibility of parole, her words carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. Mr. Mercer, you have robbed this family and this community of a bright light. Becky Hargrove represented the best of what young people can become, compassionate, dedicated, full of promise for the future. You will spend the rest of your life contemplating the consequences of your actions. As court officers prepare to lead Mercer away in shackles, he turns toward the gallery one final time. His eyes find Linda Hargrove, and he speaks words that will haunt her for the next 34 years. I didn't kill your daughter, Mrs. Hargrove, but I know who did. Someday, the truth will come out. The courtroom falls silent except for the sound of chains against metal as Mercer is escorted toward a life behind bars. Dean Mercer was convicted based on evidence that seemed overwhelming. But was it really justice or just the appearance of justice? Have you ever wondered if someone you trusted was capable of terrible things? Sometimes the people we least suspect are hiding the darkest secrets. After the trial concludes and the media attention fades, Gary Latham approaches Detective Torres privately outside the courthouse. The railroad worker's face shows the strain of months spent carrying dangerous knowledge, and his voice trembles as he speaks. Detective, I have something else about that night. Something I didn't tell you before because I wasn't sure what it meant. But before Latham can share this new information, he clutches his chest and collapses on the courthouse steps. Paramedics arrive within minutes. But Gary Latham dies of an apparent heart attack at age 58, taking his secrets with him. His final words to his wife that evening, whispered from his hospital bed before he loses consciousness forever, tell them to look for the other necklace. Richard knows what I mean. The cryptic message remains a mystery for over 30 years. Until a construction crew unearthed secrets that the real killer thought were buried forever. For 34 years, Mapleton carried the weight of Becky Hargrove's murder. Dean Mercer grew old in prison, maintaining his innocence to anyone who would listen. Gary Latham took his secrets to the grave. And Richard Lang built a career on the foundation of a lie that was about to crumble. 1990 to 2023, the slow passage of time. Dean Mercer adapts to life at Menard Correctional Facility with the quiet resignation of a man who understands that truth and justice don't always align. The first year nearly breaks him, appeals denied, visitors dwindling, the crushing reality that he may die behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. But survival requires acceptance, and Mercer finds purpose in small victories. He earns his GED at age 26, studying in a prison library that smells of disinfectant and broken dreams. He writes letters to his mother every week until her death in 2001. Maintaining the fiction that he might someday come home. The legal system moves forward without him. His appeals wind through courts with mechanical predictability, filed, reviewed, denied. Newer cases demand attention, and the Becky Hargrove murder becomes historical footnote, a closed chapter in Mapleton's story. Mercer works in the prison library, helping other inmates prepare for their GED examinations and filing legal paperwork for appeals that rarely succeed. He becomes a fixture in the law section, known for his patient explanations of court procedures, and his quiet insistence that the truth eventually surfaces. "I'll be here when they figure out what really happened," he tells newer inmates who ask about his case. Justice takes time, but it comes. Every October 22nd, Linda Hargrove performs a ritual that becomes sacred to her and meaningful to others who have lost children to violence. She drives to the railroad crossing where Becky's body was discovered and ties a silver ribbon to the crossing gate, the same crossing gate that still bears scars from the investigation 34 years earlier. The tradition grows over time. Other families who have lost children join Linda's annual vigil, creating a small gathering of people united by grief and the need to remember. Mrs. Patterson brings flowers for the son killed in Afghanistan. Jim Morrison honors his daughter who died in a drunk driving accident. The ribbons flutter in autumn wind like prayers for the dead, or like secrets waiting to be revealed. Linda ages through these vigils, her hair turning completely white, her steps becoming more careful, but her dedication never wavering. She speaks to Becky during these visits, updating her daughter on family news and promising that she hasn't forgotten, will never forget, until someone pays for what happened. "Your cousin Sarah graduated college," she whispers to the crossing gate. "She's going to be a teacher, just like you wanted to help animals. She's helping children instead." Detective Torres retires in 1995, carrying the weight of Gary Latham's silenced testimony like a stone in his chest. The knowledge that an innocent man sits in prison while the real killer walks free haunts his final years in law enforcement. But speaking out would accomplish nothing except destroying his pension and reputation. Before cleaning out his desk, Torres makes one last effort to preserve the truth for future investigators. He places Latham's cassette tape in evidence box M47, mislabeling it among materials from an unrelated burglary case. His final report contains a notation so subtle that only a careful reader would notice. Alternative suspect information available upon request. See evidence box M47. Torres hopes that someday, another detective will discover the tape and ask the right questions. He retires to a small house outside Mapleton, avoiding the railroad district and the memories that live there. Richard Lang's career flourishes in ways that would have seemed impossible to the young trooper who made a fatal mistake in 1989. He receives promotion to detective in 1995, then lieutenant in 2003, building a reputation for meticulous investigation and genuine compassion for victims' families. Colleagues describe Lang as the kind of cop who never forgets a case, who follows up on cold leads years after other investigators have moved on. His clearance rate becomes legendary, and younger officers seek his mentorship on difficult investigations. But those closest to Lang notice changes that accumulate over the decades like layers of sediment. He drinks more than he used to, bourbon replacing beer as his preferred method of forgetting. He avoids certain parts of Mapleton, particularly the railroad district, claiming that area holds too many bad memories from early in his career. His wife Margaret mentions the night terrors that begin appearing around October each year, screaming episodes where he calls out names she doesn't recognize, thrashing in bed as if fighting an invisible enemy. She suggests counseling, but Lang dismisses the episodes as job-related stress that will pass with time. 30 years of seeing what people do to each other, he explains. It catches up with everyone eventually. The irony is lost on Margaret, that her husband's night terrors center not on crimes he's investigated, but on the crime he committed. Technology advances at an exponential rate while the Hargrove case remains officially closed. DNA analysis becomes standard procedure for violent crimes. Cold case divisions form in major police departments, equipped with databases that can link crimes across jurisdictions and decades. Computer systems store and cross-reference evidence in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1989. The tools that could exonerate Dean Mercer exist in laboratories and databases across Illinois, but no one thinks to apply them to a case considered definitively solved. The Hargrove file sits in storage, gathering dust while science develops the capability to reveal its secrets. Mapleton evolves around the memory of Becky's murder, growing and changing while her story becomes part of the town's historical fabric. The paper mill closes in 2008, its smokestacks demolished to make way for a technology center that brings new families and different kinds of jobs. Young couples moved to Mapleton attracted by affordable housing and good schools, unaware of the tragedy that once defined the community. The railroad tracks remain active, but freight trains pass through without stopping, carrying cargo to destinations that matter more than this small Illinois town. Mel's Diner, where Becky worked her final shift, struggles with declining business before closing in 2015. The building sits empty for 2 years, windows covered with plywood and weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot, until developers demolish it for a strip mall that contains a chain restaurant, a nail salon, and a dollar store. A small memorial plaque acknowledges the site's connection to Becky Hargrove, but most people walk past without reading the inscription. Memory fades in the way of small towns where tragedy becomes history, and history becomes legend, and legend becomes forgotten. November 2022. The construction that changes everything. November wind carries the scent of approaching winter across Mapleton as Morrison Construction begins excavation for new sewer lines behind the old railroad maintenance shed. The area has been overgrown for decades, reclaimed by nature and forgotten by municipal planning, until infrastructure needs require disturbing ground that has remained untouched since 1989. Excavator operator Jim Morrison works methodically through the frozen soil, following blueprints that show utility lines running parallel to the old railroad tracks. The maintenance shed has been abandoned for 20 years, its roof collapsed and walls covered with graffiti, but the foundation remains solid enough to serve as a landmark for the construction crew. Around 2 p.m., Morrison notices something unusual in the excavator bucket: fragments of fabric, the metallic glint of jewelry, what appears to be human bone. He shuts down the machinery immediately and calls his supervisor, who contacts the city engineer, who eventually notifies the Illinois State Police. Detective Rachel Owens arrives at the scene within 2 hours, driving from Springfield through gray countryside that matches her mood. At 42, she has spent 15 years working cold cases, developing an instinct for reading stories written in disturbed earth and scattered debris. The construction site tells her immediately that this isn't recent burial. These remains have been underground for decades. The excavation transforms into an archaeological dig under Dr. Patricia Hayes' supervision. The Cook County Medical Examiner treats the site with the reverence reserved for historical discoveries, carefully documenting the position of each bone before removal. The skeleton is intact, suggesting respectful burial rather than hasty disposal. Among the remains, investigators find fragments of a diner uniform, size 7 shoes consistent with a teenage girl, and most significantly, a silver necklace bearing the engraving R.H. Rebecca Hargrove. The necklace has tarnished during its decades underground, but the heart pendant remains readable, its inscription clear enough to identify beyond any doubt. DNA extraction from bone marrow confirms what the jewelry already suggests. Becky Hargrove has finally been found. But the discovery raises questions that challenge everything Mapleton believed about the case. Becky's body was found in 1989, processed by authorities, and buried after the trial concluded. This skeleton suggests a different burial site, possibly a different timeline, and circumstances that don't align with the official record. Detective Owens reviews the original case files with the perspective that only time can provide. The 1989 investigation appears thorough within the limitations of available technology, but certain evidence that should exist is missing, and witness statements contain gaps that weren't apparent to investigators working under pressure to solve a high-profile case. After 34 years, Becky Hargrove's remains tell a different story than what the town believed. How could investigators have been so wrong about such a basic fact? Sometimes the most fundamental assumptions about a case turn out to be completely false. What do you think really happened that night in 1989? As Detective Owens processes the newly discovered remains, she finds something clutched in the skeleton's hand that makes her blood run cold. Another piece of jewelry, a class ring from Mapleton High School, class of 1987. The initials engraved inside the gold band belong to someone who was never considered a suspect. Someone who graduated 2 years before Becky and should have had no connection to her murder. The ring belongs to Marlene Hargrove, Becky's older sister, who died in a car accident in 1995, taking whatever secrets she carried to her grave. The discovery of Marlene Hargrove's class ring in her sister's grave revealed a secret that had been buried for 34 years. The Hargrove family tragedy was far more complex than anyone imagined, and the truth about Becky's murder would expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. December 2023, Illinois State Police Cold Case Division. Detective Owens's investigation accelerates with the urgency that comes from finally having the right evidence to ask the right questions. The medical examiner's analysis of the newly discovered remains shatters every assumption about the Hargrove case, revealing trauma patterns completely different from those described in the 1989 autopsy reports. Dr. Patricia Hayes delivers her findings with the clinical precision that makes devastating news somehow more bearable. The skeletal remains show blunt force trauma consistent with a single blow to the occipital region of the skull. However, the fracture patterns and bone density analysis suggest the victim was struck by someone approximately 6 feet tall, significantly taller than Dean Mercer. More troubling than the physical evidence is the temporal analysis. Carbon dating confirms that these bones have been buried for exactly 34 years, placing the actual burial in late October 1989. The revelation forces Owens to confront an impossible conclusion. The body found and processed in 1989 was misidentified. Dental records from that period were incomplete, and DNA testing wasn't available to small-town police departments. The victim buried under Becky Hargrove's name was likely a Jane Doe whose disappearance was never properly investigated. Owens locates evidence box M47 buried in the basement storage facility, finding Gary Latham's cassette tape exactly where Detective Torres had hidden it 33 years earlier. The recording quality is poor. Magnetic tape degrades over time, but digital enhancement reveals details that change everything about the case. Latham's voice emerges from decades of silence. "I saw 2 men down there that night. One in a diner uniform, the other in a state trooper's jacket. But there was something else I didn't mention before. I heard the trooper call the girl by name. Not hey or girl, but Marlene. He thought he was talking to someone else." The name stops Owens cold. Marlene Hargrove, Becky's older sister, who had graduated from high school 2 years earlier and should have had no connection to events at the railroad tracks that night. The investigation into family relationships and police personnel records reveals a web of secrets that explains everything while making it all more tragic. Marlene Hargrove, 22 in 1989, had been involved in a clandestine relationship with State Trooper Richard Lang, despite his marriage and her family's trust in law enforcement. Hospital records from Mapleton General tell a story of escalating domestic violence. 3 weeks before Becky's murder, Marlene sought treatment for injuries she claimed resulted from falling downstairs. The attending physician's notes reveal a different reality. Patient presents with defensive wounds on forearms consistent with blocking blows. Multiple contusions in various stages of healing suggest ongoing pattern of abuse. Patient appears fearful of male authority figures and declines to provide details about injury circumstances. Dr. Robert Chun, the emergency room physician who treated Marlene, remembers the case clearly despite the passage of time. "She was terrified," he tells Owens during their interview. "When I asked about the injuries, she kept looking toward the door as if expecting someone to come in and stop her from talking. I offered to contact police, but she became agitated and insisted her boyfriend was a police officer who would handle the situation." DNA analysis of evidence preserved from Becky's necklace clasp reveals genetic material that was never tested using 1989 technology. The profile matches Richard Lang with statistical certainty that eliminates any possibility of coincidence. The reconstruction of events becomes clear through careful analysis of timelines, witness statements, and physical evidence. On October 22, 1989, Lang encountered someone he believed to be Marlene walking home from her evening shift at the diner. In poor light and from a distance, Becky's silhouette in her uniform created a case of mistaken identity that would prove fatal. By the time Lang realized his error, that he had confronted and killed an innocent teenager instead of his former girlfriend, Becky was dead, and he faced a choice that would define the next 34 years of his life. The most devastating revelation comes from Marlene's personal diary, discovered in the Hargrove family attic during a search authorized by Linda Hargrove, who now understands that her family's tragedy extends beyond losing one daughter. Marlene's final entry, dated October 21st, 1989, the day before Becky's murder, reveals the full scope of the horror that was about to unfold. Richard called tonight, angrier than I've ever heard him. He's threatening to hurt me if I don't take him back, saying he won't let me leave him for some college boy. I'm scared of what he might do if he finds me. I've decided to leave town tomorrow morning before my shift at the diner. I can't tell Mom and Dad the truth about why I'm running. They think Richard is such a good man, such a dedicated officer. Maybe someday they'll understand. If something happens to me, someone needs to look for the man with the badge who thinks love means ownership. Marlene never made it to her shift the next morning. She left town as planned, driving to Chicago where she lived under an assumed name until her death in a car accident in 1995. But her escape came at a cost she never could have imagined. Her younger sister paid the price for her boyfriend's rage and confusion. Modern forensic analysis reveals the sophisticated manipulation Lang employed to control the original investigation. Fiber evidence from Becky's clothing matches the interior of Lang's patrol car, proving she was transported in his vehicle. Cell tower records, newly accessible through technological advances, show Lang's department radio was active in the vicinity of the railroad tracks during the exact time frame when Becky disappeared, completely contradicting the alibi that protected him for 3 decades. The silver heart necklace becomes the key to understanding 34 years of deception. Forensic examination reveals that it was deliberately removed from Becky's body and placed on the unidentified Jane Doe to ensure positive identification and close the case quickly. Lang had manipulated the evidence from the moment of the crime, using his access and authority to direct the investigation away from himself and toward Dean Mercer. December 15, 2023, Naples, Florida. Richard Lang's arrest takes place at his waterfront condominium, a modest retirement home purchased with a pension earned through decades of public service. At 78, he sits on his porch watching sunrise over the Gulf of Mexico when Detective Owens and federal marshals arrive to take him into custody. The arrest is quiet, professional, almost anticlimactic for a man who has evaded justice for over 3 decades. Lang doesn't resist or attempt to flee. His only comment as handcuffs close around his wrists. I've been waiting for this day since 1989. Neighbors gather to watch their respected retiree, the former police officer who organized community watch programs and helped elderly residents with home repairs, led away in chains. The contradiction between the man they knew and the monster he had been creates cognitive dissonance that will haunt the Naples community for years. During the 18-hour drive back to Illinois, Lang begins talking with the compulsive need of someone who has carried secrets too long. The confession spills out in fragments that investigators will later piece together into a complete timeline of murder, cover-up, and decades of living with guilt. I loved Marlene, Lang tells Detective Owens, his voice carrying the weight of 34 years. When she ended our relationship, I couldn't accept it. She was the only good thing in my life, and losing her felt like losing everything. I went looking for her that night to convince her we belonged together. Lang describes the moment of realization that still haunts his nightmares, seeing Becky's face in his flashlight beam, understanding that he had killed an innocent girl while pursuing her sister. The panic that followed led to decisions that condemned an innocent man and allowed a killer to flourish for decades. Richard Lang spent 34 years as a decorated police officer, protecting a community that never knew he was a killer. How many other cases might have been solved differently if he hadn't been controlling the investigations? Sometimes the people we trust most are hiding the darkest secrets. As Lang's confession continues through the night, he reveals information that shocks even experienced investigators. Becky Hargrove's murder wasn't his only crime. It was simply the first in a pattern of violence and corruption that spanned his entire career. Over 30 years in law enforcement, Lang used his position to eliminate at least 3 other people who threatened to expose his activities. Gary Latham's fatal heart attack in 1990 wasn't natural. Lang had access to medical supplies and knowledge of Latham's cardiac condition. 2 other witnesses to various crimes died under circumstances that appeared accidental but were actually carefully orchestrated murders. The investigation into Richard Lang has only just begun, and Mapleton is about to learn that their most trusted protector had been their most dangerous predator all along. The trial of Richard Lang began on March 4, 2024, in the same courthouse where Dean Mercer was wrongly convicted 34 years earlier. This time, the truth would not be buried beneath lies and manipulated evidence. Justice had finally found its way to Mapleton, Illinois. March 4, 2024, Madison County Courthouse. The courtroom atmosphere carries weight that transcends typical criminal proceedings. Advanced forensic evidence, DNA analysis, and digital communication records create an overwhelming case that exposes 3 decades of deception. Prosecutor Maria Santos methodically presents a timeline that reveals not just a single murder, but systematic corruption that allowed a killer to flourish while an innocent man rotted in prison. The gallery fills with a different crowd than witnessed Mercer's trial. Aging residents who remember Becky sit beside younger family members who have heard her story passed down through generations. Members of the wrongful conviction advocacy community attend to support Mercer, while law enforcement professionals struggle to understand how one of their own could betray everything they represent. Lang's recorded confession becomes the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The jury listens in stunned silence as his voice fills the courtroom, describing the fatal mistake that set 34 years of lies in motion. I knew Dean Mercer was harmless. Lang's voice crackles through the speakers with mechanical clarity. That's what made him perfect for what I needed. He was nervous, had no real alibi, and the community would accept him as the killer. I planted evidence knowing it would be enough to convict him. I never intended for it to go this far, but once it started, I couldn't find a way to stop it. The defense team attempts to portray Lang as a man destroyed by decades of guilt, pointing to his exemplary police record and the deteriorating mental health that manifested in night terrors and alcoholism. Character witnesses describe an officer who went beyond duty requirements, who comforted victims' families and worked cases long after his shifts ended. But Santos counters with evidence of Lang's continued manipulation throughout his career. His exemplary service record was built on protecting himself, not serving justice. 3 additional cold cases show signs of his interference when investigations threatened to expose connections to his crimes. Richard Lang didn't become a monster overnight, Santos tells the jury. He spent 34 years perfecting his ability to manipulate evidence and eliminate threats. Every commendation he received, every promotion he earned, was built on the foundation of an innocent girl's grave. Linda Hargrove's testimony provides the emotional center of the trial. Now 73, she moves slowly to the witness stand, her silver hair catching courtroom light as she raises her right hand to swear the oath to tell the truth. Something that was denied to her family for over 3 decades. Her voice remains steady, but her hands shake as she describes 34 years of living with incomplete justice, trusting the system that had betrayed her daughter and her family. Officer Lang attended Becky's memorial service, she tells the court, her words carrying across the silent room. He helped carry her casket from the church to the hearse. He looked me directly in the eyes and promised he would never stop searching for her killer. He said Becky deserved justice, and he would make sure she got it. Linda pauses, collecting strength to continue. Every October 22nd for 34 years, I drove to that railroad crossing and tied a silver ribbon to the gate. I prayed for justice. I prayed for someone to catch my daughter's killer. I never imagined that the man I was praying would capture was standing right beside me at her funeral, helping to bury the girl he had murdered. The courtroom remains silent except for the soft sound of crying from the gallery. The verdict comes after 6 hours of deliberation, swift by the standards of complex murder cases. The jury files back into their seats with faces that reveal the weight of their decision. Guilty on all counts. The words echo through the courtroom. Murder in the first degree, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. At 78 years old, Richard Lang receives a life sentence without possibility of parole. Judge Patricia Coleman addresses Lang directly before imposing sentence, her words carrying the moral authority that comes from presiding over justice finally served. Mr. Lang, you didn't just kill Becky Hargrove. You killed justice itself. For 34 years, you corrupted the very system sworn to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. You wore a badge that represents honor, integrity, and service to the community, but you used that authority to cover up murder and destroy an innocent man's life. That badge has been forever tarnished by your actions. Lang shows no emotion as he's led away in shackles. The same courthouse that had once witnessed his testimony against Dean Mercer, now serving as the site of his own condemnation. December 18, 2024. Dean Mercer walks out of Menard Correctional Center as a free man after serving 34 years for a murder he didn't commit. At 58, he's institutionalized and gray-haired, blinking in sunlight that seems brighter than he remembers. The world beyond prison walls has changed dramatically during his incarceration. Cell phones, internet, social media, technologies that didn't exist when he was convicted. The state of Illinois awards Mercer $2.1 million in compensation, approximately $62,000 for each year of wrongful imprisonment. It represents substantial money, but no amount can return the life stolen from him. His mother died while he was incarcerated. His fiancée married someone else and raised children who never knew his name. Friends moved away or forgot him entirely. Mercer uses part of his settlement to establish the Truth and Justice Foundation, dedicated to supporting other wrongfully convicted individuals and improving the criminal justice system that failed him so completely. Money can't give me back my 30s, 40s, or 50s, he says during his first press conference as a free man. But maybe it can prevent other innocent people from losing their lives to lies and corruption. The memorial service for Becky Hargrove, held exactly 35 years after her murder, becomes a ceremony of healing for the entire community. The event takes place at the newly dedicated Rebecca Hargrove Memorial Garden, built on the actual site where her remains were discovered. Linda Hargrove, supported by her surviving family members, removes the silver ribbon from the railroad crossing gate for the final time. The ritual that sustained her hope for 3.5 decades is no longer necessary. Justice has finally arrived. Becky can finally rest, she says, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd of several hundred people. The truth about what happened to her has been told, and the man responsible will spend the rest of his life in prison. She turns toward Dean Mercer, who stands quietly at the edge of the crowd, still adjusting to freedom and public attention. Dean, I owe you an apology that's 34 years overdue. We failed you. I failed you. I let my grief and desire for justice blind me to the possibility that the real killer was manipulating all of us. I'm sorry for the life you lost because of our blindness. Mercer steps forward, his response showing the grace that sustained him through decades of imprisonment. Mrs. Hargrove, your daughter was an innocent girl who deserved justice. You were a grieving mother who trusted the system to find her killer. Neither of us is to blame for what Richard Lang did to our families. Detective Rachel Owens closes the case file with the satisfaction that comes from finally revealing truth that was buried for over 3 decades. The Hargrove investigation becomes a landmark case study in how modern forensic science can overturn false convictions, but it also demonstrates how easily truth can be corrupted when those sworn to protect it choose personal interest over justice. The Hargrove case proves that justice delayed is not justice denied. Owens reflects as she files the completed investigation. It's justice waiting for the right person to fight for it. But it also shows how vulnerable our system is to corruption from within. Richard Lang wasn't some outside criminal. He was the system, and he used that position to destroy lives. Owens's work continues with 3 additional cold cases that show signs of Lang's interference. Other families deserve the same truth that finally came to the Hargroves, and she's committed to uncovering whatever other secrets Lang buried during his career. As autumn rain begins to fall over Mapleton, the same gray drizzle that covered the town the night Becky disappeared, the Rebecca Hargrove Memorial Garden stands as testament to the power of persistence in seeking truth. The silver heart pendant that started this journey sits in an evidence locker, no longer needed for court proceedings, but preserved as a reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. Dean Mercer attends the garden dedication, standing beside Linda Hargrove in a moment of reconciliation that transcends their shared tragedy. Both have been victims of Richard Lang's choices, and both have found a measure of peace in finally knowing the truth. If someone you love goes missing, never stop fighting for answers. Truth has a way of surviving even the most elaborate deceptions. Justice may be delayed, but it's never truly denied. Becky Hargrove waited 35 years for justice, but her story proves that the truth always finds a way to surface. If this case moved you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that prove justice delayed is not justice denied. And remember, sometimes the people we trust most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. What case would you like us to investigate next? Let us know in the comments below.